afternoon, everyone. On behalf of RIKK, the Institute of Gender Equality and Difference, and UNU-GEST, the United Nations University Gender Equality and Studies and Training Program at the University of Iceland, I would like to welcome you all to the third talk of the 2019 Spring Term Lecture Series. This year, the lecture series will explore the connections between gender, health, and trauma. The lectures are held in collaboration with the National Museum of Iceland. My name is Geeti Chandra, and I'm faculty and senior researcher at the UNU-GEST, and I will be your moderator today. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Zilka Spahić-Šiljak, associate professor at the University of Zenica and at the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies of the University of Sarajevo. Zilka is also a research associate at Stanford University for the last 4 years and has published several books. Her new book on gender, culture, and leadership will be released soon. She also runs the Transcultural Psychosocial Educational Foundation in Sarajevo, which includes projects on trauma, memory, and healing. In today's lecture titled Victim or Survivor, Choosing Identity and Being Acknowledged After Wartime Sexual Violence in Bosnia, Dr. Spahić-Šiljak will look into body politics and the ethnicization of women's bodies, how the feminist debate and the language about victimhood, survivorship, and agency empower or disempower women in dealing with their identities, how to go beyond the victim-survivor binary imposed by international donor politics, scholarship, and women's organizations, and how to enable new vocabulary for self-identification. So, Zilka, it's all yours.
Hello, everyone. It is nice to be here, and on behalf of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies of the University of Sarajevo, I would like to use this occasion and thank the Institute for Gender Equality and Difference and the colleagues who organized my visit here to teach and to give lecture today. And thank you all for coming. My talk today is about complexity of survivor-victim identity in the post-war Bosnian context, in which many women still suffer in silence because the pain is not heard and acknowledged, or if it was, the acknowledgement was not properly done by the state institutions. Wartime rape women are pushed into one of the boxes to be victim or a survivor without asking them what they think about it, and also whether the administrative procedures in acquiring the legal status for compensations were sensitive enough to keep their dignity and to take care of their well-being. As one of the survivors explained to me, and I quote her, "We are not victims. I don't want people to think I voluntarily sacrificed something," end unquote. Another quote, "It is a shame that after so many years and endless testimonies of atrocities that has happened to us, there is still no law that would put a stop to our suffering. The war is not over for us," end of quote. Through my oral history work with women peace builders in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as with returnee population in eastern and western part of the countries over the course of 10 years, I collected narratives of many wartime rape survivors and victims who revealed their stories years after my permanent peace work in their villages in that period. Once they felt comfortable enough to share their pain, they started talking. In today's presentation, as it was announced, I'm looking into the body politics and how women's body was ethnicized and politicized, how the feminist debate and the language about victimhood and survivorship and agency empower or disempower women in dealing with their identities, and also how to go beyond the victim-survivor binary imposed by international donors, scholarship, and also women's organizations, and how to enable new vocabulary for the self-identification. First, I want to say something about the context and ethnicization of women's bodies. Sexual violence and other forms of violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the entire Balkans region are gendered and ethnicized, because gender and nation, as Julie Mastov concludes in her studies, and I quote, are intimately participating in the formation of one another. During the wars in the former Yugoslavia, women were targets of sexual violence and mass rapes, and they were targeted because their bodies represented one of the three main ethno-national groups, the body of the nation. Sexual violence was a tool of ethnic cleansing, according to UN reports. And depending on the region, it was systemic or sporadic. Helsinki Watch reports say that all sides committed sexual violence in the former republics of Yugoslavia, but the Yugoslav army and the Serb paramilitary groups appear to be using rape on the larger scale and with impunity. This is from their report. Feminists in the Yugoslav region had opposing views about the war and wartime rape crimes, and some of them condemned all men on all sides, while others single out Serbs as the main perpetrators of these crimes. Women on all sides were raped in the wars, dividing the former country of Yugoslavia, and we shouldn't get in trap of ethnicization and suffering of these women. But the fact is that systemic rape of Bosnian Muslim women cannot be overlooked. Elisa Helms, in her anthropological studies in Bosnia and Herzegovina, wrote that rape was, and I quote, used as systemic tool primarily by Serb forces, or as highly organized and calculated systemic rape of the Bosnian Muslim women by the Bosnian Serb army, as Olivera Simić, another scholar, found in her work in that region. Stasha Zajovic, from Women in Black, anti-war activist from Belgrade, also states that ethnic cleansing was not a consequence, but rather one of the main aims of the war, end of quote. And elaborating further on that, she contending that, and I quote, cleaning, the word cleaning in our language, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, is a local word for abortion. Or to clean out oneself means the main objective of ethnic cleansing was to completely clean the territories of the other ethnic group, using women's body, for that purpose. The prevailing media and political discourses portray women who survive sexual and other forms of violence as either victims or survivors, with certain expectations imposed on them. Torn between these two identities, some brave women became agents of change for themselves and for other women, while some remained silent under the pressure of the imposed ethnic narratives. Some rose up against victim-survivor binary and labels and claimed the right to articulate their own experiences. While working in the field on various human rights projects, I had an opportunity to talk to many women who survived wartime rape and who were active in local organizations or who individually tried to encourage other women to testify or to seek help in women's centers. Some of them embrace the existing labels of victims or survivors, while others do not find them compelling and resonant with their own feelings and perceptions of the violence that was done on them. While much has been made of the ethnic dimensions of rape, feminists insist on referring to these atrocities as gender-based violence. They view this gender-based violence as deeply rooted in the patriarchal value system, in which women are treated as the property or territory of men, nations, or people. This type of violence is closely related to power, and feminists confirm, and I quote, "Rape serves to prove power and establish hierarchy. This hierarchy, however, as Cynthia Cockburn found in her research, is part of militarized, masculinized, patriarchal cultures that continue to oppress women with hierarchical gender policies and structural violence of the inefficient governmental institutions even after wars end. Femininity, masculinity, and heterosexuality, as Dubravka Žarkova explored in the Balkans, were crucial in production of ethnicity and ethnicized bodies. In feminist literature, the female body was discussed as a domain of power and dominance. And in ethno-national ideologies, the female body was used as paradigm for territory, homeland, nation that should be protected, nurtured, and respected, or defeated if it is the enemy's body or territory. Woman's body was and is still a battlefield, an object for many scholars, practitioners, and ethnic and religious communities. That body represents primarily the ethnic and national paradigm of purity, chastity, and sacredness. Women are not generally invited to speak about their own bodies simply because those bodies do not belong only to themselves. Actually, their bodies belong more to a male, to a family, to a community, and a country, and they are either celebrated or glorified as holy mothers and a paradigm of ethical virtues and perfect women, or rejected as fallen Magdalens who should bear the stigma of shame and guilt. Since a woman is considered the guardian of her family's moral life, it is expected that she be silent about sexual violence for the sake of those who claim the right to her body. By complying with the social gender norms, she maintains her family's dignity. Given the moral double standards of patriarchal societies in which women survivors of sexual violence live, only some of them dare to report these crimes. Public acknowledgement of such crimes could have devastating results on survivors' family life. And when I asked one of the survivors why she chooses silence, she responded with the question, who would want to associate with the family of a woman who was raped and consider marriage with her children and socialize with them? The cultural blame and shame complex perpetrated by the patriarchy strongly discourages survivors from sharing their personal stories. Women were pushed into the role of safeguards for family values and, by extension, protectors of the entire moral fabric of their societies. Therefore, they had to internalize their pain and suffering in order to maintain a dignified silence. Now I want to say something about conceptualization of victim-survivor identity. Victimhood, survivorship, and agency are widely debated in the scholarship of many disciplines. But understanding the interplay between them in the lives of women who survived wartime rape and other forms of violence in the recent war in Bosnia and the Balkans requires the exploration of various social, political, and cultural factors in the post-war context. I'm focusing today on language as one of the very important factors of learning, knowing, and reflecting. Through discourses, we determine knowledge and truth, and discourses construct power and knowledge, as Michel Foucault explains. In discursive frameworks, people learn about themselves, but they also learn how to position themselves. Since language not only reflects, but also constitutes a social reality, the subject as well as her or his experience are revealed through language. When scholars, practitioners, or women who survive sexual violence use certain words like victim, survivor, raped women, agents who survive rape, These are political acts that determine what they want to communicate, or what someone helping them or exploring the subject matter may want to convey. The notion victim in Slavic languages, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, is žrtva. In everyday communication refers to a person who survived various types of violence, including wartime rape, that happened beyond the control of the person and under coercion. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, victim is one of the official terms used by some women's organizations and activists, as well as media and state institutions that regulate the status of women and men who survived violence. Some women use it, finding it important to draw attention to the status of those who need help. Women War Victim Association from Sarajevo, Our Voice from Tuzla, and some other organizations use this term, but underline that they work against the conspiracy of silence in order to regain dignity for women who shouldn't bear shame or stigma for something for which they were not responsible. They claim the proactive agency of victims who struggle to position themselves in Bosnian society, and they do not want the government to pity them, but to secure their social and economic rights. Another label is survivor, preživjeli, which requires another word or words following it to explain what they survived. So one needs to say women or person who survived violence, and some women or in feminist organizations like Medica Zenica, Vive žene Tuzla, La Strada, Mostar, and many other in Bosnia use that term survivor as an empowering notion which with positive traits for active agents who experience violence, but decided to live and move on with their lives despite the challenges. It seems that in this way, survivors attempt to preserve their dignity through message that they are above the violence they suffered and they do not want to be perceived as helpless victims. The individualism discourse encourages women to show that they are responsible, strong, and decisive to overcome pain and suffering. Many women use both terms interchangeably, without assigning particular weight of a meaning to either notion. However, some women's NGOs and media, as Elisa Helms noticed in her research, selectively use these notions depending on the context and the audience. The pervasive media image of the woman who survived rape is a poor refugee village woman in traditional clothing. In fact, the majority of refugee women who are raped come from rural areas, but urban and educated women's activists oppose this portrayal as misinterpretation. They also believe that there are so many women from urban areas who are highly educated who survived sexual violence, so they do not want to be represented monolithically and to be reduced to poor, helpless women. Not surprisingly, therefore, they attempt to avoid their identity's balkanization. The Bosnian woman is other for the men of her own ethnic group, and second to neighboring ethnic groups in Bosnia and the region, and finally she is the other to the Western world, which uses neocolonial lenses to define its periphery, which requires civilizing and rescuing. Multiple marginalization and othering make some women's activists oppose the victim label. If they use it, they understand it as transitional process from victim to survivor. Some scholars explain this, like Young and McGuire, and some women refer to it as it's not that you are a victim or that you are a survivor. Instead, you move from one end where something was done to you, victim, to where you do something about it, survivor. Some women, however, do not want to be labeled as victims or survivors, but as women who experience certain types of violence, or simply human beings who suffered or who experience injustice. For them, any narrative, any story about violence is contextualized and personalized. Thus, they do not want to dwell in either of these categories, but instead they want to have freedom to self-conceptualize their experience. They want their own story to articulate what they experienced as women and human beings. Dubravka Žarkov also warns about the limitations of agency and victimization narratives, as well as lack of other possible narratives and experiences, which should include the space for women to label their experiences outside the victim-agent binary. Theoretically and practically, the victim-agent binary has limitations, but the question is, what kind of language do women have at their disposal to accurately represent what has happened to them without essentialization, alienation, and expectation? I'm particularly interested in the feminist debate about victimhood, survivorship, and agency because of the predominantly liberal feminist discourse that insists on the term survivors as something active, positive, and agentive versus the notion of victim, which is understood as passive, negative, and lacking agency. Chris Gilligan, for instance, confirms this essentialist understanding, and I quote, "Victims are, by definition, passive objects who have been acted upon by other forces, not active agents. They are defined by the mark that has been made on them rather than mark that they have made on the wider world. In as far as they are victims, they are devoid of volition or intent," end of quote. Some anti-victim feminist scholars like Katie Roffey or Christina Hoff Sommers, as well as Naomi Wolf, who coined the term victim feminism and power feminism, criticize the perpetual victimization of women as passive and highlight the concept of survivorship that connotes to choice, agency, resilience, responsibility, and individual. But as Gudrun Dahl notices, they dwell on personal agency and responsibility, which is important, but they neglect the roots and causes of structural violence and social and political circumstances that enable it. These anti-victim feminist scholars see portrayals of women as victims of the capitalist system and neoliberal economy as false or bad gender feminism that insists on structural changes of the system and dismantling traditional femininity. Judith Butler also concluded that feminists should provide counter-positions beyond the paradigm of victimization in terms of negative connotation of the notion, but she didn't exclude structural violence and oppression. In the feminist debate, as Rebecca Stringer explains in her recent work, there is need to question the anti-victim feminist discourse because it reinforces a neoliberal discourse of power and neglects the origin of structural oppression and discrimination. One of the ideas is to reclaim victimhood, but as Rebecca Stringer proposes, and I quote, "reclaiming lies between the pole of celebration and jettison," end of quote. Now I want to say something about identity paradox. And I will start with some questions for all of us. How should one be a raped woman today in the post-war Bosnian or any other context? And how can one survive the social stigma of shame and personal feelings of guilt and responsibility for her well-being and for her family? How does one cope with the imposed identities of victim or survivor? How may one position oneself and narrate the experience of rape? Does rape define who one is? Or should the woman define what she survived, who she is, or a man? Women responded in different ways to these questions and grappled to understand what happened, why it happened to them, and how to live with that experience. The majority of women have chosen silence as method of survival and sacrificed their own subjectivity, pain, and suffering for a bigger cause, for the sake of their own families. They internalized the narratives of victimhood and oppressive scripts, and they did what Uma Narayan calls bargaining with patriarchy. And in order to survive, social norms imposed on them. Even when these women are accepted by their families, no woman wanted to be branded a raped woman in the community. It is primarily, as one of them from Srebrenica explained to me, that they still had to live with people. They made preference maximizing choices from within their constraints, being aware of injustice of the patriarchal social norms that suppresses their subjectivity. Women victims, survivors, or raped women have the agency to decide how they will deal with their experiences, because agency is not limited to one of these identities, as anti-victim feminist scholars claim. Agency is also not only related to liberation, advocacy, resilience, and subversion of the patriarchy, as Saba Mahmoud elaborated. It can also be a voluntary act of submission. In the case of some Bosnian women who do not want to be labeled raped women, their agency was expressed in their voluntary act of submission to the social norms. It is important to recognize not only oppression of patriarchal societies, but also the disguised oppression of well-intended neoliberal discourse that perceives gender structural oppression as, Rebecca Stringer says, and I quote, individual problems of personal responsibility or as depoliticized social problem. The rhetoric of personal responsibility, agency, gender-neutral language make victims, survivors, and women who suffered from various types of violence responsible for recovery and healing. If they are unsuccessful, as some women never fully recover from these experiences, they are responsible for this as well. Women cope with sexual violence and trauma in different ways, and so many factors influence how they identify themselves and how that identification evolves over time. Many women have accepted and internalized the victim label and feel entitled to claim certain rights as victims. But sometimes they internalize their trauma so intensely and dwell on it so much that they cannot escape the victim circle. They seem fully absorbed by the victim narrative. The identity of a victim, the only one that matters for some women, or the only one that resonates as an acceptable form of expression. And as one of the women said, and I quote, "We are victims, and we will keep saying that as long as we live, because we lost everything. This is what we have. We do not give up, and we will not allow perpetrators to live in peace. And we will not allow the state to forget our suffering and pain. Every time we show up, we will remind everybody of the crimes committed over our bodies. They cannot silence us." End of quote. According to the recent studies conducted by Medica Zenica about women in Bosnia and Herzegovina who survived wartime rape, 57% suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. 70% say that the rape still fully governs their lives. 65% reports that they use drugs, while 76% confirm that their trauma influences their relationships with men. Some women who were empowered through therapy programs managed to move from being a helpless victim to agentive survivor and became strong enough to continue life and help other women to cope with their own trauma, as they variously narrated from their experiences. Although most of these women have never fully recovered, they've rediscovered meaning in their lives and have goals, including raising their families and helping those in need. Despite the pain they still feel, they report that they successfully cope with their trauma. The survivor label thus better explains and articulates inner struggle to overcome shame and guilt. Some women, however, face difficulties in meeting these expectations of the survivor identity, to be strong, empowered, and ready to change. A woman who was 14 when she was raped, got married after the war, but didn't find understanding in her marriage and her environment. She narrates, and I quote, "When I reported my rape for the first time, everybody talking about me as a victim. And in the beginning, I didn't mind. When I noticed that people felt pity for me, referring to me as that poor woman, I couldn't accept it anymore. So I decided to embrace label survivor, which was something powerful and something that tells people she is not some poor woman. She's fighter, she can handle this. But over time, I realized I couldn't handle it. I didn't feel better. And despite all the therapy I have been through, I'm really scared and I have the same fears. And yet everybody expects me to feel better and be courageous as a survivor." This is the typical victim-survivor paradox, which discloses a deep psychological dilemma over her identity and the way she copes with her trauma and expectations. The paradox we find in the above statement of the raped woman shows the limitations of these two labels and how women struggle with transition from one to another. This might be one of the reasons why some of the women reinstated silence as a viable model of survival that doesn't place expectations upon them that they cannot stand or fulfill. Some women, although vocal about their experiences, do not want to embrace any of these identities because they find them hegemonic, intrusive, exclusivist, and divisive. They choose to be women who have been raped or simply women who experienced violence. They choose to that very narration of the experience construct their identity, which is not fixed and stable. For them, rape is not the first word that should identify who they are, because they are first and foremost women, and some of them say, and I quote, "I'm not a raped woman. I'm not the one. I'm not the poor woman. I do not feel well in these boxes. I don't want to let anybody define me." If a woman refuses one of the available identities, victim or survivor, and if it doesn't resonate with how she feels, what else is available to her? What kind of language does she have at her disposal? Knowing that language reflects and constructs the reality in which we live, can the language include and describe individual feelings and situations? Tammy Spry, in her analysis, answers that our lived reality doesn't recognize the complexity and diversity of women's experiences with sexual violence. She wants women to make new language and meanings because the existing categories of victim and survivor are phallocentric, describing a woman as the object of man's action. Some women do not want to be defined by someone else's action, but by their primary identities as women and human beings, whose integrity was violated by someone else's actions. Woman's body is colonized and culturally detached from a woman and her experience, and when she narrates painful experience, she should have agency to define it, but not separately from her own body. Tammy Spray therefore suggests, and I quote, liberatory epistemology, which is a liberation of ways of knowing, of exploring how we know what we know, the discovery of a room, a body of our own, a site where a woman might tell a story of sexual violence, where she, her body, is the locus of meaning for her experience. Woman's body cannot be dislocated from her experience and thought. Spry further concludes that a woman's body should be a meaning-making agent, and that the telling of her experience is performative and liberatory act. That problem, the problem remains. How can we develop women-centered language that is emancipatory and liberating within the hegemonic power of socially constructed views about sexual violence? What are the tools available? How can we make them accessible to women and make the new vocabulary acceptable in the society, knowing that most of us use cognitive shortcuts to define someone without due respect for another's experiences? How shall we develop new vocabulary in Bosnian and other societies and cultures where a woman and her body are objects owned by man, the family, or the nation? How can we produce new knowledge and pursue emancipatory practices when the linguistic discourse is masculinized and subordinated to oppressive gender roles? One of the ways is to provide a forum to narrate women's experiences and open dialogue with the new vocabulary which they will bring through their narrations, or which they will accept from other women or scholars who are attuned to these kinds of experiences. Through stories and dialogue, women can gain recognition and build self-respect. With the new language tools, women can self-identify how they want and how they feel. They need to be subjects who will narrate and teach us how to present their experiences, and not mere objects of ethno-national ideologies that generate divisions over women's bodies and claim to protect Bosniak, Serb, Croat women rather than women who survive sexual violence, whatever their ethnic identity is. Postmodern feminist scholars proposes the gesture of reclaiming the rightful self-identification that lies between the poles of celebration and jettison, making reclaiming a satisfactory way to frame the response that is needed. If women feel safe and comfortable with the victim or survivor identity, they shouldn't be pressured to meet the expectations of victim and anti-victim feminist claims. If they want something else that they feel best reflects how they want to be perceived, then they need to be allowed to construct a new language shaped by their experiences. However, the challenge is not only to provide the space for these narratives, but also to prepare other women and men to listen to these experiences without ethnicizing the pain and suffering, and survivor-victim agency that is limited by the dominant ethno-national discourses. In conclusion, we can say that women who survive different types of violence during wars and conflicts shouldn't be theorized as mere objects of power, but as agents who can claim and reclaim their identities. This is important to acknowledge in each context. But as Katie Davis argued, women's bodies and what they symbolize and represent in particular culture are produced through a variety of social and political relationships. Production and reproduction of women's bodies is closely related to language. Therefore, women should have safe channels to tell their stories and through their own narrations create proper naming of what they have experienced. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you. Stay here. We still need you.
Yes, we need you desperately.